Hello and welcome to everyone watching. We're excited you could all take the time to join us today for our webinar. My name is Erin Bremer. I'm a graduate assistant for the Zaire Institute, and I will briefly be going over our agenda for the next hour and a half before I pass things over to our host for today, Jonathan Swartz. We'll begin with Jonathan introducing our guest speakers who will share a bit about themselves and our topic for today. Following their conversation, there will be time for questions and answers, which will be moderated by Jonathan, our host. Comments and questions from viewers can be submitted through the comment section on whichever platform it is that you're viewing the webinar from. Once that Q&A session has concluded, I will come back and share a few announcements related to the Zaire Institute and the Center for Justice and Peace Building to wrap up. We hope that you're able to stay until the end of our time together, but if you can't, there will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Zaire Institute's website and YouTube channel by early next week if you'd like to return to it or share it with others. Thank you and enjoy, and I'll pass it over to Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. Good morning, afternoon, evening, night from wherever you are participating and watching this webinar live. We're excited about this conversation with some dear colleagues from New Zealand and want to just get started right away with introducing them. I am Jonathan Swartz, the Associate Director for the Zaire Institute for Restorative Justice, and excited to be your host today. First, our first guest that I would like to introduce is Joey Wheeler. Joey is a New Zealand television sports commentator and former rugby union player. Joey had a successful career as a professional athlete with notable performances with Suntory Songalaya in the Japanese top league, the Maori All Blacks, Tasman, Crusaders, and Highlanders. Joey and his wife Courtney live on the South Island of New Zealand and are kept busy by their two young children. Welcome, Joey.
Tēnā koe, Jonathan. Kia ora koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai to all of you out there. Ko Joe Takawingoa, ko Nai Tau tuku iwi, ko Aoraki tuku maunga, ko Wai Makariri tuku awa. Thank you very much for having me join this chat. Just a little bit about what I just said is just spoke about where I'm from. So I'm from, as Jonathan alluded to, the South Island of New Zealand. My mountain is Mount Cook, Mount Aoraki, and my river is the Wai Makariri.
Thank you, Joey. And let's introduce Haley Farrar. Haley is a restorative practices educator and facilitator. A former lawyer, she now helps organizations implement restorative approaches both proactively and reactively to prevent and repair harm. Haley is the managing director of Aspen Restorative Consulting. Haley, would you like to say anything by way of quick introduction of yourself?
Just kia ora. It's very nice to be here.
And finally, we'd like to introduce Dr. Jeremy Simons. Jeremy is an educator, organizer, and community-focused researcher in restorative justice, peace building, community development, and public health. Jeremy's also a graduate of the Center for Justice and Peace Building. His practice and scholarship draw on experiences in conflict transformation, interfaith dialogue, appreciative inquiry, and indigenous accompaniment around the world. He currently works as a senior research fellow at the Te Gapara Center for Restorative Practice at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. Jeremy, anything you would like to say by way of quick introduction of yourself?
Good morning, or good afternoon, rather, depending on what part of the world you're viewing from. It's great to be here. Thanks, Jonathan.
And the title of the webinar is Echo Effects of the Microaggression, Lessons Learned from a New Zealand Restorative Dialogue After Public Harm. We'd encourage those of you who are watching from our StreamYard platform or potentially from the Zaire Institute YouTube page or Facebook channel to please feel free to comment. ask questions, use the comment section of the platform that you are watching from at any point during this presentation. So how we're going to do this is we'll start with Joey talking a little bit about what happened and describing kind of Joey's experience. Then we'll ask Haley to share a little bit about the process itself of restorative dialogue, and then Jeremy will give us some larger context, the larger context within which this harm and also restorative dialogue process occurred. So Joey, would love to hear what happened and talk about your experience.
Thanks, Jonathan. So as Jonathan alluded to, my background is I'm an ex-professional rugby player. So I played professionally for 14 years, and due to a neck injury, had to finish up at the start of 2021. I moved in from there into broadcasting with the Sky Television Network here in New Zealand, and work predominantly in the rugby sphere. So whether that's as a commentator, a presenter, or a content creator for Sky. But my background, as Jonathan alluded to, the last 5 years of my career was spent up in Japan. So my knowledge of the Japanese culture and the language and how they sort of operate as a culture and a people is pretty good. And but that knowledge and probably a little bit of ignorance on my behalf on screen, especially live television, I made a faux pas live on air post a match. A teammate of mine who was playing actually for a New Zealand rugby team this season had an outstanding game, and I made a comment in the post-match while interviewing another player, a bad taste comment that was, I suppose, in my head, funny, but obviously it went down like a cup of cold sick, for a lack of a better word, with the New Zealand public. What I said was to the player, I mentioned that the Japanese player, Kazuki Himino, who was one of the best on ground that day, I mentioned to a teammate of his that he was really good in a Japanese accent. Now, inside the Highlanders environment, they would constantly chip each other around accents. That was consistent with my experience while over in Japan in my 5 years. My poor Japanese, their poor English, the in-jokes inside the locker room were constant. And it was actually found it was a really good way of breaking down some of the barriers culturally between the foreign players and the Japanese players. But obviously on live TV, that's a whole nother ball game, and rightfully so. It wasn't well received. It created a real storm online, and essentially as soon as I got off air, my phone was inundated with alerts across all social media platforms. I immediately jumped on my Twitter and made a formal apology. Obviously, there was no intent whatsoever. Obviously, the intent wasn't to cause harm to anyone or to offend anyone, but that happened, and I was obviously extremely remorseful for that, and felt terrible that I'd caused any harm or had hurt people, which was certainly not my intention. Like I said, it was to make a joke, which was a consistent joke in-house, but obviously on air in front of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of viewers, isn't the right place to be doing that. But where that came from was obviously my lived experience. And then I guess from there, the fallout was significant. That night, everyone that I was around well, it'll blow over. It certainly didn't do that. It manifested like a bushfire, really. It just got bigger and bigger. We were heading into a public holiday, so there wasn't a hell of a lot of current affairs going on. So I remember the next day I didn't actually fly home. My family, I flew my wife and it was just my eldest child at that stage up to our hometown, which is at the top of the South Island, Blenheim, small little town, to try sort of get away from the noise. And I met them there, and I remember sitting in my parents' lounge room on a Sunday night after the incident, and I was having a beer with my dad, and my dad sort of said to me, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. We call each other Jock. He said, it'll be fine, Jock. Don't worry about it. It'll be gone by Monday. It'll be fine. Next thing you know, on the television news, leading the news was my ugly mug sitting behind the newsreader. Sky TV presenter makes racist comment. And I looked at him and I said, I don't think that's going away in a hurry, Dad. And it certainly didn't. I guess the process from there that we went through, Sky took me off air for a few weeks, and we started the process, which I wasn't sure what was ahead of me. I thought I was gone. I thought, I'm going to be out of a job. How do I support my family? That was my first thought. So a lot of, I guess, worry and concern from my half. But I must say that Sky were extremely supportive, and there was never, not that they alluded to that to me in the first week. I thought I was on a cliff edge, but apparently their process, I was never going to be terminated. It was more working through a process, a restorative justice process, which obviously we'll go through soon. But my experience of the process was probably the most emotional and confronting sort of week or so of my life. I had no understanding of what a microaggression was before going into the process. So for me, like, I took so much away from, I guess, the ignorance or even arrogance of the New Zealand public towards microaggressions and how they are perceived and who they hurt and how common they are. I'd never heard of that word before until I went through this process and understood it. And it certainly made me a better person to understand how it affects different, I guess, parts of our community and society, and what we can do better to help educate others around it. Because, yeah, I know a little bit about, I suppose, white privilege, but never really understood it because I saw myself as an inclusive person, a respectful person, and someone that, doesn't harbor any sort of hatred towards anyone, but obviously made a bad judgment and a joke that was distasteful and that caused some harm. So getting some real understanding around that stuff was invaluable for me. And that process, albeit extremely confronting and emotional for me and my family, was probably the most rewarding thing I've ever done as well. So a really awesome experience, albeit probably the toughest one of my life, but an invaluable experience for me.
Thank you, Joey, for sharing about your experience. So much there, the kind of intent versus impact, the locker room versus live TV, I'm reminded of this quote that is actually behind me on this poster. It's one of my favorite quotes from the author James Baldwin, and it says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And so, kind of this process of like facing and being accountable to the impacts of what one had no ill intentions to do, and yet the impact was harmful. Haley, want to invite you to share specifically about the restorative justice dialogue and how that came about and the various parts of that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks for sharing your story, Joey. I came into the picture and after Joey had already been taken off the air in that first couple of weeks. And the folks at Sky were people that I had known from previous work in different organizations. And so they obviously already had an understanding of restorative justice and what that could look like in cases like this. And so they had that in their mind of this could be an opportunity for really repairing and healing instead of just getting rid of Joey and trying to silence the conversation. At the time, the Stop Asian Hate protest and movement was kind of live on the ground right at the exact same time. This was at the end of 2021. And in New Zealand, we're a little bit delayed around some of those issues reaching our shores, but that was definitely a live topic. And as a part of the media's kind of attention that was on Joey at the time, the news had been interviewing community organizers with the Stop Asian Hate community organizing efforts. And so they'd already been speaking into the issue. They'd already been talking about their experience and how those comments had hurt them. And so they'd been a part of the national conversation already. Sky TV had reached out to these folks to ask if they'd be willing to engage in a more substantive kind of dialogue with Joey, and they were enthusiastic to do so. So they were very gracious and willing to have a really hard conversation to raise awareness of the issues and to get kind of advance that cause of understanding specifically racism against Asians in New Zealand. We had a very quick turnaround on this. I think the whole thing happened within a couple of weeks. And one of our great challenges was that while we had some leadership and community representation, in talking with her, we really wanted to figure out a way to bring in more voices, to acknowledge that even though she was in a leadership position, she wasn't the only voice of that community that was important to include. So we decided together to pull together a very short, brief Google form that had 2 questions on it, which she shared with her community. The questions being, how did these comments affect you and make you feel? And then what would you like for Joey and Sky TV to understand about your experience? She sent that through her community of people that were involved in her groups. They shared it with their friends and family, folks that had been having conversations about these issues. We had a couple dozen responses, and these were later read into the process. So we had a representation of not only members of that activist group, but also of the broader community of people that were kind of addressing this issue, speaking into the process a little bit. One of the other things that I thought was impactful about the process itself that was maybe a bit unique was that before we got to the facilitation, they asked that Joey do some reading and do a bit of research about microaggressions and understand what that was, understand a little bit about the Asian experience of racism in New Zealand so that they weren't starting from scratch within the process. That had been important so that they could have a shared vocabulary, so that they could talk about it beforehand. And so that was something that we had done prior as well in preparation. Through the process, it looked just like a typical restorative justice process. We used a talking piece. We heard everyone's experiences. We talked through impacts from each perspective, and we're able to arrive on some pretty tangible outcomes, mostly around Joey using this position of privilege and platform to raise awareness of this issue, really wanting to address this more proactively and say, no, we actually need to take on this issue as Joey said just a moment ago, talking about an attitude of ignorance and arrogance is what you said around microaggressions or casual racism in New Zealand. And so really wanting one of the outcomes to be, how do we look at this as like a societal impact and do something more substantial? And so that's part of why we're here today, is a part of the commitment from the process itself. But there were also representatives of the organization in that process of Sky TV speaking about how they can do better within that organization. So it wasn't a particularly, I don't think, as the facilitator, a particularly innovative restorative process. It was maybe a unique application of it, but the actual kind of script of the process had those two things that felt a little bit unique. And otherwise, it would be just like you'd see kind of anywhere else.
Thank you, Haley. Can I ask just a quick follow-up question? You talked about the timing of it, like it all happened within a couple weeks time. What are the positives that go along with like that kind of a quick turnaround, and maybe what are the additional challenges, or what gets left out when it gets because that's an incredibly quick turnaround for something like this. But yeah, can you talk about some of the kind of the positives, but also some of the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of there were a couple of reasons for it. Firstly, Joey was off air at the time, and so there's a bit of organizational pressure to figure out, is this going to work? Like, can we do it this way? Is this appropriate? You know, we are hearing Joey taking the kind of responsibility that we want to enable and to celebrate when we do things like that go wrong. But is this really going to happen? And so there's some organizational pressure to just make a decision and figure out what to do next. There's also some pressure around the news cycle, being aware that the news cycle moves very quickly, and that if we drag it out forever, it will just become its own new issue again later. So wanting to kind of capture it while it's fresh, which we did miss. The 2 weeks was still too late. Joey offered a live public apology on air from the football pitch or the rugby pitch. And there was no media around that. You can't find it. Nobody talked about it. Just a couple of weeks later, it was already kind of old news. But so that was kind of a part of what was leading it. And also just wanting to address something really important with the urgency that it deserved, noting that there'd been a lot of harm immediately that had kind of happened, and wanting to address that really quickly. Some of the constraints that led, I think that if we'd had a lot more time, or if we'd been willing to sit with it for months, maybe we could have found other creative ways of including other voices. Maybe we could have done more listening circles. We could have involved more participants. I could imagine doing kind of more proactive community involvement over a longer amount of time. That's something that I think that we wound up having to sacrifice just to get the process rolling, as was also a stated need of the community organizer, who is a student at home. So who needed to get back to her normal place of living. Some of the benefits of it were, I think, and you know, Joey could answer this probably better than me, but I think one of the main benefits was that it was still a very live emotional experience. Like I heard Joey just now speak of it being the most impactful one that he's experienced to date. And I think that part of that was there hadn't been a lot of time for processing what had happened. It was still very raw, not only for Joey, but for the other participants. It was still pretty elevated. And I think for this particular experience, and maybe that would be harmful in another situation, but for this one, it felt kind of appropriate to capture that while it was ripe, to do that live, to remember how important it is, to remember how urgent it is, instead of moving past it or doing like individual healing. It just felt very fresh. And so I think that did increase probably some degree of the impact on the participants to do it so quickly.
Yeah, thank you for offering that, and I'm sure we can keep coming back to some of these questions later. But like, I hear you kind of naming the micro, like what do we do with this very particular harm, and then how that relates to the macro. And so would love to just invite Jeremy to give us a bit more of the macro perspective. What is the context within which this very particular set of harm, a set of harms occurred, and also the restorative dialogue around it.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan and Haley and Joey. I think it's, one of the interesting things about this is that in a sense, at the micro level, at one of the micro levels, for example, with Joey and the person he was talking about and talking to, there was no actual harm. They thought it was funny because it was that whole contextual piece of something that within, say, the locker room was not considered harmful. But outside of that, there was a whole nother level of sort of public harm with people who were not personally related. So in some ways, that's a little bit different from how restorative justice or the kinds of situations restorative justice oftentimes address, where you're actually dealing with the direct harm between, say, two parties. So I think that's one really interesting thing to note about this process. It doesn't minimize the other harms that were out there. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that when this happened, as Haley mentioned, the Stop Asian Hate movement was really kind of at peaking, which was coming out of the COVID-19, the pandemic time, out of the lockdowns. There was a lot of sort of social pressure, a lot of frustration around the lockdowns themselves, and then push and that sort of polarization that we had seen develop around the use of some of those pandemic measures, and the discourse around the coronavirus being the China virus, coming, from Asia. And so there was this increase, particularly in the US, of, and high profile incidents of Asians being attacked, of, experiencing different kinds of abuse and, both direct and, indirect violence. And so, so that's all sort of in the background. And some of that was, and that translated here as well. One of the big differences that New Zealand had actually closed its borders for quite a long time. So there was all that had, well, as a public health measure that was effective, it also created this sort of insularity and kind of inside-outside dynamic that I think was also sort of affecting the situation. Sort of in a bit of a longer term context, we were also, and this was particularly where my interest comes in, is in 2019, we had the Christchurch mosque attacks, which affected a lot of people. And I don't think that was necessarily directly sort of brought up in the situation, but that's also in the background, especially if many of the members of those mosques are Asian themselves and have been dealing with this background of experiencing anti-Muslim or Islamophobic attacks and harms as well. So sometimes I think it's important to sort of highlight that, because there's a perception of New Zealand being sort of a bit of an idyllic, place where, we were able to avoid some of the sort of the impacts of COVID, fairly tolerant and all these things. But beneath that, in New Zealand has its own history and experience of racism, of colonization, of social harms, of at different levels. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, a group of there was a social event with a costume party, and a group of young people showed up dressed as the Ku Klux Klan, and that made it into the news. And it was one of those cases where, for those people, there was sort of this unawareness of the fact that the Ku Klux Klan actually also has a history starting in the early 1920s in New Zealand, when it was imported from the United States. So these sort of long-term racial and cultural sort of challenges exist here. And so that was, I think, important to keep in mind. And what Joey, mentioned, like, for him, not really realizing that, saying certain things and those kinds of behaviors can actually trigger some of those deeper social experiences is, what was one of the things that happened here.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Jeremy, for giving us a bit of the larger context. Wondering, as you all kind of hear each other relay your experiences or your perspective on this, what new thing did you learn from hearing others speak, or what question do you have kind of for each other? I mean, engage in a bit of dialogue amongst yourselves.
I've got a question. Joey, I wonder if you'd be willing to share a little bit more about, you said that it was one of the most emotional experiences of your life. Would you be willing to share a little bit about what really impacted you? Like what that change was?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, obviously, I think seeing people hurt, that was what I struggled with the most, is that, I don't know how to describe it. That's why I found it so emotional and so confronting, was like we've alluded to, that the awareness wasn't there around the understanding of the behavior, but actually hearing people's stories and what they've gone through, and then understanding that and actually putting myself in their shoes and going, holy heck, and like what I've been doing for years, or what I think's funny is not, and potentially might have brought up a lot of hurt for some people, and that hurt me, and I think that's why it was really emotional and confronting. I was embarrassed as well, because people who know me know that's not who I am, but I did something, but my perception, because of my role and my privileged role of being a public figure, is then I'm perceived by other people in a way, and that was another thing for me. Like my reputation, I was, I suppose, terrified that I was going to be known as a racist for the rest of my life, and that was really hard for me to get my head around. That you Google my name and that's going to be the first thing that pops up for the rest of my life. So yeah, a mixture of all of those things, I think, Haley. But I suppose that also, what we said, your quote, Jonathan, that accountability piece, it's confronting, and it's, it's smacking you straight in the face, but it can do a lot of good as well, and it has, in terms of, I guess, where my head's at in this space moving forward.
Mm-hmm. What were teammates' reactions, or what are the other voices contributing to your?
Yeah, this is what was really hard, I think, the noise around it. And I've talked a little. I haven't talked publicly about it, but it was really polarizing. The middle could see where it was from and could see that, no, he's owned his actions and he's going to do something about it. Then there was a lot of hate coming towards me around, you're a racist, like jumping to really dark sort of conclusions. Then there was the other side, the actual racists that were piling on and support, thinking I was a racist. So that was the really hard bit, and that was immediate. The next day when I was in Christchurch Airport, I had a lady come up to me and basically abuse me for being a racist, and then it would have been all of 5 minutes later, I had a man come up to me and basically congratulate me, so you're going through both of these sort of conversations of, mate, no, that's not who I am. You've got it all wrong. You need to sort yourself out. Like I was wrong. And then it's trying to own it, apologize to whoever I'd offended, and then say that I'm going through a process. So that was really tough as well. That was probably the toughest bit, and across social media, seeing everything. And I think, like, your private messages filling up with people basically calling our family racist, to the point my wife's Instagram getting filled up with racist breed racist sort of thing. And so that was, the other side of it that I couldn't quite get my head around. In terms of teammates and friends, they were really supportive. I think there was a casualness to them as well, like around it all. So my process and sort of educating them was really helpful as well, and they took a lot out of it and got a lot of understanding. In terms of the Japanese community, they were extremely supportive. They know, again, who I am, what I'm all about. So there was a lot of support from that part of the world, and a real deep understanding of it, what place that came from, and how it came about, I suppose. So just a lot of support from family and friends. There were a couple of people that we lived in the same apartment complex in Japan with a couple, and the wife was extremely vocal online, and probably a little bit, that hurt a little bit, like probably cut a little bit deeper than others. Yeah, I mean, it felt a little bit, I don't know, if she was hurt, that I don't want that, but it sometimes felt a little bit over the top, if that's the right word, probably not the right word, and was, kind of just piling on for the sake of piling on in many ways, but I apologized to her and tried to mend that bridge, but she just wasn't wanting to engage in that at all. So, those were the tough ones, Jonathan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What other questions, comments do you have for each other, Haley?
I think that just kind of jumping off the back of something you just said, and it's not so much a question as an observation, which is that within this kind of harm and the ripple impacts of those affected just being massive. Joey mentioned maybe millions of people being touched by this moment and this issue. And with a restorative intention of repairing harm, we're never going to be able to do that for everyone. And I guess that as a facilitator, my choice was, do we try? Do we try to repair it for those who are open and receptive to that, knowing that we're not going to ultimately be able to put it right for everyone? And so I think that for some people feeling impacted by those comments, they weren't interested in that kind of healing. They weren't interested in engaging in the conversation. And we were super limited by how we could involve everybody in it. We started with the leadership of the organization and kind of went up from there. But I don't want to overstate the impact of the restorative process on the issue itself or on the harm that was experienced by others. It was clearly transformational for Joey to sit and actually hear from people who had been affected by it, what their experience in their life had been, what their experience of these comments had been. And I can say, I don't want to overrepresent their experience as well, but there was gratitude to Joey. There was gratitude for the process. They spoke of never having had a white person apologize to them before. And so how meaningful that had been to actually hear someone own and apologize for a racist comment was something that was new for them, that carried its own degree of healing. Of course, that won't translate and ripple to everyone. I can assume they shared that with their community, with their personal community, and I assume they carry that with them to some degree as an experience of theirs. To what impact, I don't know. I doubt that it forever healed the issue of racism. I wouldn't have been surprised if the very next day they experienced a microaggression from someone else. So I don't want to say, oh, we solved racism against Asians in New Zealand through this restorative process, but we were able to contribute, I think, positively to the conversation rather than further it negatively.
Yeah, the whole, even in our title for today, the echo effects, right? Like harm has an echo. And I think those of us in the restorative justice world, we hope that repair also has echoes, right? And it can't echo everywhere to the extent that we wish it could. And yeah, that kind of leads into a question from one of our viewers, Mary Jackson, just commenting, "This super powerful," and this question of how did those affected respond. I think Haley, you've already talked a little bit to that, but I wonder if there's additional commentary on that.
Yeah, I guess the one other thing worth including is that through the process of soliciting more input through the Google form, some people wrote really briefly, like a pretty flippant, "this was bad" kind of comment, and others took some serious time to write a thoughtful response and to reflect on it. And even within those comments, some of them were saying things like, "Oh, I'm interested that anybody cares what I think." The fact that there was kind of an invitation to the broader community at all to contribute, for some people was well received as like, "Oh, thank you for allowing my voice to be heard by Joey." I know that anecdotally, there are a few people that were like, "Oh, I get to actually say how I was affected, and Joey will hear that." And that alone, even though Joey didn't have the opportunity to respond to those people because it was an anonymous feedback form, that alone, knowing that that person who had caused them harm was going to be hearing those impacts, was again impactful for them. So I think that there were a number of things about it that, again, if we'd had a lot more time, that was the main issue that I think I would have liked to have explored in a more comprehensive way, is like, how can we more fully address the community response? But I do think that, those ripples of repair, hopefully, of just the experience of you can be heard when something harmful happens, can be positively contributing to healing sometimes.
Yeah. Jeremy, it looked like you were ready to offer something or ask a question.
Well, I mean, again, I wasn't part of the direct process, but, my interest came in really around some of the things that, just are being discussed, which is, as a restorative justice practitioner, we often talk about the importance of community being involved in a process and then being part of that repair of harm. But when something happens sort of in cyberspace or social media, that community can be fairly amorphous or transient and a bit sort of disconnected. And I think we even see that in this conversation, that we weren't able to actually bring in the people because they've moved on to, other geographically, physically, perhaps, sort of emotionally and whatnot. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we face, in addition to, many of the other things that have been mentioned. But there's a fundamental challenge to our notion of community. And for restorative justice practitioners, that's something that I don't think we've grappled with probably enough, in terms of how does the digital sphere and social media and all these forms of electronic communication, how does that actually influence how we do our work and what we hope to accomplish? It may also open up, again, this webinar is an opportunity as well to extend the conversation. So it actually provides a way to bring that potential positive outcome, to share that, can we even talk about healing? And I think, to understand how that might be able to be spread around in different ways. So, yeah.
There's a wonderful question that just came in, more logistics related, that I'll put on the screen here. But could you say a bit more about how this process was set up? So who initiated, who bore the costs, and the contracting? So imagining Sky News legal people having maybe some concerns. Maybe Haley, maybe you're best suited to speak to some of those questions.
Yeah, Joy might know a couple of these answers as well. Briefly, the people who initiated it were Sky TV. The person who was in charge of the people and culture team was, again, someone that I had worked with in the past at a different organization. In New Zealand these days, thinking about the legal liabilities and sphere within New Zealand is pretty different from an employment relations perspective than in the States. And so it's actually ever increasing, looking at building restorative justice components into the HR processes in New Zealand is actually these days quite common. And so a lot, especially bigger and or public sector employers, generally have an awareness of restorative practices. Actually, in the Employment Relations Act in New Zealand, there's a mandated component that says that you have to try to repair the relationship before you can get rid of anybody. And so that concept of repair of relationship is well infused throughout kind of human relations law in New Zealand. So there's a bit of context of just kind of a generalized, like, raised awareness of the option. I'm sure that the legal team had some risk. I know more so than the legal team, the public relations and like people responsible for managing Sky's reputation would have been the ones that had greater concern. And I know that they had debates and conversations internally within the network. And I know that the folks who made the decision spoke very vehemently about, no, this is the right thing to do. And we're going to do it because we need to address these issues of racism head on. We're not going to pretend it didn't happen. We're not going to push it to the side. We want to address issues of equity and injustice more fully. And we think a restorative way is going to more authentically and more genuinely engage with issues of social concern. Because they had been through a facilitator training with me, they understood the process in depth from the outset. And then additionally, they were hearing and watching Joey take that responsibility right up front. And so that, I think, was part of what triggered them to think, I think this could fit with restorative, and a restorative option is because we're seeing that accountability come through. In terms of like who covered the cost and stuff like that, Sky did. So the network paid for the process and the space and getting people where they needed to be in order for it to happen as well.
Thank you. I'm going to put some other really good questions up here. This one contains two questions from our colleague Sydney Morgan. But first question for Joey, how will you share your experience when and if you have the opportunity to talk about how powerful an RJ process can be? So this question of how do you talk about it? And then I will leave this question up here as we discuss. But then for Haley, as a facilitator, would you say that harms that occur within racial intersections and RJ process can be considered for healing? But maybe go to Joey first. How will you talk about this experience?
Yeah, there's this one thing that I've been sort of, I guess, struggling with a little bit since the incident and since the process of how we create a little bit more awareness or noise, for the lack of a better term, around the microaggression issues, but also the restorative justice process. I think when we were working out what I was going to do in terms of an apology and all that sort of stuff, it was trying to figure out what the best platform, how we go about it. But in all honesty, like, I think from my perspective, if someone asks me to be involved in a discussion, which is in a safe environment like today, I'm more than happy to share my lived experience. And if that can help people, then I'm more than happy to do that. In terms of, I suppose, how else I could do that, I think that'll evolve in itself when it feels right. I think there's still a little bit of concern from me, especially if I was to use my social platforms to really push a message that it could create that real divide, which I don't want to happen, if that makes sense, which I saw with my incident. So I think more the education process around understanding microaggressions and also the restorative process is probably the best way. But I've avoided previously when I've avoided podcasts full stop since the incident, but that I'll probably change that in the coming future and discuss it in some form, but obviously on sort of, I guess, my terms and my lived experience, and not so much diving too deeply into it to try create a debate or division, more so just talking about my experience of it all. And that's the way I think it's best handled, rather than getting into sitting in a public forum and having a debate about microaggressions. That's not the way for me. I don't think. Yeah, but I definitely think my being a public figure, I can help influence some change for sure, and that is certainly front of mind for me.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we. I think that, you know, with a lot of restorative processes, but certainly with this one, there's been kind of a fine line of like, what would cause further harm? Like, how do we address this kind of conversation and this issue and share the positive learnings and the impacts out of it without inflaming the debate? Because as Joe's describing, not wanting to get in the middle of people who think that everyone's being too hard on Joey versus people who are really hurt, and stirring more conflict and more harm and more opportunities for that, while also addressing the issue, is just very delicate. And, you know, it sounds like, Joey, you just taking it kind of one step at a time is what feels right in the moment and organic, that isn't raising the risk flags. Then, okay, maybe we'll take that step when it feels safe to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Haley, a little bit on this question of harms that occur with kind of racial intersections. Can RJ process be considered for healing?
That's a big question, and I think it's pretty personal. I think in terms of, I don't know, I guess thinking about like the macro, micro, like meso levels, on that macro level, like I think one of the big positive impacts was, as Joey described, not having, like, raising awareness, not understanding how this joke could have such a big impact, like how things contribute to a racist climate, or how they contribute to harm. And so mitigating that through awareness, through education, in a way that feels safe and not controversial. It feels like it wasn't a you're right and wrong. It was, let's just listen to the harm here and maybe make a change. And so I think that the restorative approach, by offering that framework, can make a big difference for how people address issues where they're more likely to be positional or defensive. By setting it aside and going, we're not having that debate. We're just listening to the harm, and you take what you want out of that. So I think that the framework can be positively contributing to the issue. Is it going to change everything? No. Is it going to solve our societal problems around racism? Probably not for a long time, but it feels like, you know, a drop in the bucket that feels positive. In terms of the personal healing of the participants, I touched on this before, but at least for those involved with us, they described a sense of healing. And I also wouldn't overstate that, because they still have to go through their lives experiencing it. So will they experience racist harm from Joey? I don't think so. Not again. That doesn't seem likely at all to me. And so in that regard, from that incident, does that feel healed? I hope so. Without asking them, I don't know. Will they be healed on that issue of living their life as an Asian person and experiencing racism at different moments? I can't imagine that they would. I don't know what the impacts would be. That'd be something we'd have to ask them, probably not even right now, but in 20 or 30 years, what the impact was of that experience for them. So I guess it's like, I have like a cautious optimism around it, as like, could it address these issues? Sure. Will it save us? I don't know.
Mhm.
Could it help? Ideally, it's not hurting. So is it just one of many things that could be contributing? I hope so.
Yeah. I'm glad Jeremy unmuted, because I was going to come to Jeremy and kind of like, given your research, Jeremy, and the things that you are aware of. I mean, New Zealand has a particular history around restorative justice. And so I would love to hear your perspective as well on this, this RJ and racial harm, and how that can play out in the context of New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand's experience with restorative justice, you can't really talk about without also talking about Māori justice. And I don't want to conflate those or say that those two are the same things. There are some shared values and perhaps some shared approaches, but a Māori or an indigenous approach that has been and continues to be sort of pushed forward here in New Zealand has its own important place in this. And that is really affecting some of those larger picture, structural, social and cultural aspects or dynamics over the long term. So I think restorative process can be a good friend to that if it doesn't try to take over those kinds of processes. So that's an important thing, and I think that's something that's, in a sense, is very helpful for New Zealand in terms of moving forward, is there is that strong advocacy and movement, and sort of historical things. We have a thing called the Treaty of Waitangi. It was an agreement signed between colonial government and Maori chiefs, and that provides sort of a foundation and a framework for relationships between Maori and non-Maori here in New Zealand. So there's been commentary around sort of how, and debate as well as how that fits with the restorative process. I think for me, the important thing is that while New Zealand has a strong history of within the restorative justice movement, I think, and again, this is not just New Zealand, I think restorative justice practitioners, I think we're still really trying to figure out how do we engage in the space where you've got harm that is mediated through social media or digital spaces. I just don't think we've addressed that here in New Zealand or anywhere else. And in the research that I've done, I mean, if you do social media and restorative justice Google search, you're not going to find a lot of like scholarly articles out there. A handful. And if you just do a search on restorative justice, you'll find thousands and thousands of things. So my hope is that this kind of conversation is also an opportunity for us to sort of connect together and build part of that larger social movement that also addresses the structural aspects, the cultural aspects, these things that, the interpersonal, while important, that's not where that sits. And so I think, I'm happy to hear from people, who would also share this or be interested in this sort of community of practice. How can we amplify voices like Joey's, experiences like Joey's? And, I've been thinking, a few years ago in Australia, there was a AFL rugby player, Adam Goods, who experienced a lot of, there was a whole racial conversation that happened with his experience. And so I think in this space around public figures, particularly in sports, we have a situation now, and this is not around race, but around, sort of gender and sort of male-female dynamics, sexuality, or not sexuality, but power imbalances with what happened after the World Cup with the Spanish football team. So what does restorative process have to say about that kind of situation? So I think there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of places where we can be having, further conversations.
The comments on social media are a good segue to a question from one of our viewers that I know is doing work in the university context here in the U.S. But this question of did you or Stop Asian Hate get any feedback from people who were unhappy or particularly happy with the process? And Tabor had to step away because working on a case that involves social media right now. So the complexities around social media and how do we talk about harm and how do we talk about who's impacted are very real in that space. But feedback from Stop Asian Hate, what was there feedback from those groups?
Not about the restorative process, at least not as I heard. Joey, I don't know if you wound up hearing anything else. I mean, as I mentioned at the start, one of the outcomes had been of the facilitation was that Joey would offer an on-air public apology, which I just don't think very many people saw at all, because you had to be a subscriber to the network in the first place. So it would have had the same audience as the original comment. But the original comment got rebroadcast on national news, and this most certainly did not. There was not the same media appetite for a thorough, heartfelt apology made in collaboration with the harmed parties. And so that conversation, I feel like that's one of the real limitations when we're talking about it more like broader application of restorative framework to these kinds of issues, is how do we keep the conversation going about subjects that require more than 5 minutes? These things are bigger conversations that need a little bit more time to have a thoughtful conversation about. And are we really giving time to thoughtfulness online at all? Not usually. So I think that that's a real limitation and challenge. But because of that, I didn't hear very much feedback at all as it carried on. I think just as the news cycle moved on, everybody else kind of moved on as well. But that doesn't mean they weren't positively or negatively impacted. It just didn't make its way back to me. I don't know, Joey, did you ever hear anything?
No, not directly, and I think that's probably one of the pieces of it, like the apology and whether that got to the people that I hurt, I suppose, essentially, like whether they heard that, and that was a network decision as well, and that was probably one of the frustrating things for me. I did a live on air apology, and then that never got resurfaced again through social media channels or whatever. And there was probably maybe from a PR perspective that was the reason for that. They didn't want any more noise around it or any more, I guess, attention being brought to it, because the news cycle had sort of moved on from it being as vigorous as what it was. So that was a little bit frustrating, because I was, obviously open to and willing to be involved in whatever the community needed me to do to help sort of restore, or get over that harm that I'd caused. So I was open to everything, but I suppose there's a few more people that are involved in that decision-making process.
I'm just putting a comment out to that to the platforms at this point. Really appreciating Jeremy's call for a community of practice around this RJ and social media and how this shows up. What are the various impacts? What are the challenges? What are the benefits? And so my comment is inviting, send us an email at zerinstitute@emu.edu, and let's see if we can get a community of practice started. So for those of you who are watching or seeing this later, interest in that specific type of community of practice, let us know. Let's see what we can do to build a network of support around it. A comment specifically related to impacts on Joey himself. Wondering if Joey can speak to the impact of the RJ process on yourself. Maybe such things as, are you a different parent because of this experience, a different spouse, a different teammate? What has changed in you because of this experience?
I think I'm far more considerate and understanding of everyone's lived experience, and especially from different cultures now, and understanding how passing comments can have an effect. I certainly am more aware of the white privilege now that we have, and understanding that. So I definitely think it, like I said at the start, it was the most emotional and confronting process for me ever. And but yeah, I think what I got out of it, what I learned from it about myself, but also about our society as a whole, I think, yeah, that will help me as a parent, with my kids and how we bring up our kids, to understand all of that and what they say, how that can cause harm and all those sort of things. I think this is going to shape me in a really positive way for the future. I've got no doubt about that. And I already find myself calling things out that might be said in, my family or other people's family, where I'm like, oh, you can't say that. And it's just an awareness thing, right? And you can do it in a way, that you're like, it's not offensive. It's just, look, someone might see it in this light. From my experience, this is how it could be perceived. And, it doesn't need to be a full-blown argument about the ins and outs. It's just an awareness thing. And I think the more we can do that, the better. And if I'm doing that and my kids are doing that, then hopefully we're making the world a better place, I guess. Pretty simple, really. But we know we're not going to be able to change the world, but I know that we've certainly changed, and we're a far more educated around it all now. That's been the real benefit of the process.
How do you? So this all occurred at the kind of end of your career, correct?
Yes, I just literally retired in officially in the January, and then I was straight on air for what's our competition's called Super Rugby. So I was doing that. So straight on air and the end of February. I can't actually remember the date that it happened, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was just imagining there's the piece of the, you can't say that, right? Like that's often how it comes out. Like you can't say these words, and that's important, not to say things. Then how do we start to change the context within which those words have meaning, right? So what about I was imagining, what if this had happened early in your career? Does it change what the locker room looks like on a team that Joey Wheeler is on, right? Does it, where are the spaces where this kind of the language and the perspectives are grown and encouraged because of it being a safe space, right? But then also how does that translate to what happens outside of those spaces?
It's a tricky question. Yeah, I certainly think if I was in a rugby environment now, my behaviour would be a lot different to what it was I was in it, for sure, after the incident. I don't really know how else to answer that. Sorry, Jonathan.
No.
Other than that, yeah, I think in any sports environment, it's a really safe, family. It is essentially a family, right? So there is a lot that probably goes on that maybe if it was in the out in the public, that it certainly wouldn't be acceptable. Do you know, if that makes sense? But probably having the guts in that environment to stand up and say something, that's the toughest thing to do.
Yeah.
And I certainly think that if I had my experience and then been in the environment, I'd have more confidence in calling it out because of the lived experience. But you sort of, it's a weird one to explain, if that makes sense, of a team environment. You've all been involved and you understand that probably.
I have
Yes.
a related question. Is there something about sort of the competitive nature of sports that makes it as conducive or more or less conducive to, say, a restorative process or to an apology being given? Or are there some other things at play that that are different?
Yeah, I think there's a real single-mindedness, and especially in professional sport, around like to get there because it is so competitive and so cutthroat. It's very much sometimes look after number one before the rest and bugger the rest, because your livelihood, your career is at stake. So there is an essence of that, yeah. But generally in a team, you're all buying into the one philosophy to hopefully get to that spot, and that comes down to leadership, I guess, and making sure that you're holding everyone accountable for whatever actions, and if they don't align with your values, then you've got to call that out. And yeah, I certainly think that however you frame that, the competitiveness of a sports of a sporting environment, the individual personalities and values are all different, right? But you've also got a melting pot of cultures in that environment, and the understanding. It all sort of works, but there could still be. I still think there's a lot of room to get better in that respect, without a doubt. Yeah, and understanding what the Tongan community need, what the Samoan community need, the Asian community inside that group. The cultural understanding is, that it's like, no, this is how we've done it. Basically you've got to conform, not we've got to understand and grow our to encompass everyone and to grow the understanding. I suppose that's a better way of looking at it.
Because I know in some spaces, especially in sort of more conflicted areas, there's whole movements around sports for peace, teams sort of and using that platform to really build those relationships, not just at the interpersonal level, but at the sort of communal level of playing against teams from a group, a social group or a political group that maybe is not one that would traditionally be within that competitive sphere.
Well, we've got about 5 or 10 minutes left. I'd love to just give you each a chance to make some final comments. Doesn't have to be long, but yeah, just invite each of you to give some final perspectives. And I don't think it has to go any particular order, but
we can go. Look, again, I think for me, just going through this again, and I guess in many ways reliving it has given me another sense of how invaluable the process was for me personally. But yeah, I think I've still got a long way to go in terms of my understanding of the microaggressions, but this process has certainly it enlightened me and my family, and hopefully I can be a voice to help share my experience, and if that helps other people, then that's great. Go through whatever issues that they're working through in terms of the restorative process.
Thanks, Joey.
I think that the main thing that I can kind of come back to when I think about this is, it was such an honor for me to be able to guide these folks through a restorative process. And from a facilitation standpoint, it was one of the easiest cases I've ever done, because the participants were so genuine and generous and authentic and so willing. So not only Joey, but the others involved had such both courage and honesty around their fears and hesitations to come into a process like this, around a conversation like this, but also that generosity of spirit that they had was just outstanding. And I guess it just reminds me of, in being a restorative practitioner, we often can focus on like trying to use an RJ process here or use a restorative process here, or like if we could only get it in here. And I think just it felt more natural. It's like just enabling it to happen where it was desired, and it just felt really organic. Of this is the right thing to do for the situation, and so the more times that we can just simply invite it and like make it available to the right circumstances are going to be the right fits for those folks. So was it a perfect process? Of course not. Was it what we need to do next time? I don't know. It's going to depend on the people at the heart of it. And so I guess it just felt like a real blessing to me that the stars aligned for it to say, this is right for these folks. This is right for this issue. This is just going to be what needs to happen. And fortunately, we had the people with the knowledge and the skills to be able to identify that and loop in the process really, really seamlessly. So I guess my hope would be that for any and all issue, even though we kind of started off from this perspective of like, well, how are we going to do that? It just felt like, well, it could work. We'll give it a try. And so not letting perfectionism get in the way of a good thing, kind of not trying to need to know how to do it just right for this innovative, application, and just trusting the process at the end of the day, that the foundations and the framework are going to guide us to something that's going to be better than nothing is generally how I've appreciated, I guess, operating out of. And so I've just been very grateful to everybody in the process to enable us to do it. And just really a ton of gratitude to you, Joey, for being willing to continue to share your experience. I think it's beautiful to see your commitment following through 2 years later, even still carrying on with those outcomes that you agreed to. Trekking along, I think, demonstrates the genuineness of those commitments in the moment. Like, nope, we're going to return to this again and again because it was really impactful. And so I really just want to say thank you to you for that.
And I need to thank Haley and Joey. I mean, I came along much later, as part of a little bit of research I was doing. But, there's, I think for me, I'm looking at where are the access points for these kinds of processes, whether it's in sport, whether it's, there are so many spaces, whether it's through a human resource, Haley, it's the work you've been doing, whether it's through other avenues in community, in the different communities that we're part of. But, I was reading recently as I was sort of getting ready for this conversation, and there's a saying that often circulates in restorative justice circles: hurt people hurt people. But there's another part that I saw recently that said healed people heal people. And so I think that's what this sort of illustrates, is that we have the potential to be healers through this process and to build that network, that community of people who are, focused on healing, about bridging, these personal divides, these social divides, and building, creating the conditions as well that are better for everyone. And so that requires hard conversations, private conversations and public conversations. Mm-hmm. But I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation as we go forward, and appreciate the Zare Institute, Jonathan, for hosting this and for your work in this space over the years. So thanks so much.
It has been our pleasure to host this. Joey, in case you need encouragement, there's a comment that's showing up that's saying, if this is your first time speaking to folks about your experience, you rocked it. Thanks for your openness, and thanks to all for the valuable conversation. So
yeah, thanks for the nice comment, Christine. I just saw it there. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, such a good reminder of the intuitive nature of restorative justice. This whole who's hurt? What was the harm? Who's impacted? What do they need? How do we make this as right as we can? And how do we move forward in continuing to make it as right as we can? Want to leave you with that. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. I'm going to turn this back over to Aaron for a few closing announcements.
Yes, thank you to all of our guests for sharing your stories and your work with us, especially to Joey for your vulnerability, and also to Jonathan for guiding us. Before we close, we have here an announcement about our upcoming webinar. You are invited to join us on October 18th to discuss Taming Our Egos as Restorative Justice Facilitators with guests Cheryl Wilson and Mark Umbright and host Hannah Kunda. They will be discussing some mindfulness-based practices and deep compassionate listening as facilitators by working with breath and silence. I know I am very much looking forward to that conversation. Please note that the time for this next webinar will be returning to our typical time slot of 12 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You are also encouraged to check out our website for our archive of other webinars touching on equally rich topics over the last 11 years, and to keep up to date about events and resources of the Zare Institute. We also welcome your partnership in the work that we do, and we are extremely grateful for your continued support. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.